Hello, my name is Scott. My handle is Web and Root on Twitter and a bunch of other platforms. This is the first video I'm going to be making in a series of videos about solving old hack the box challenges and machines. The idea is that hopefully these videos will just help you maybe close some knowledge gaps or give you some ideas about processes to follow. I'll just be kind of going through the processes I follow to solve a lot of these boxes, and I'm hoping that will be beneficial to anyone learning Hack the Box and or TryHackMe or other kind of platforms like that. Before I get into the individual boxes, I want to make a short video about VPN connections and how to actually set up your machine to test Hack the Box, because usually when you're doing Hack the Box or TryHackMe and you just can't reach the machine or things aren't working, a common debugging step you'll get is to restart your VPN connection. And that comes up a lot, and so I wanted to make a short video kind of demonstrating why you would get those debug instructions or what that's actually doing behind the scenes so you can better understand if you run into problems on your own and how to best debug them. So I kind of made a diagram that we'll start with here. So kind of taking a step back, I'm assuming you have some insight into the idea of public versus private IPs. If you don't, essentially public IPs are IPs that are meant to route traffic to a machine on kind of the public network or the internet as you could think of it, whereas private IPs are used more for routing traffic within private networks, so kind of your home network and maybe corporate networks or private internal networks, that kind of stuff. If you want a much more in-depth answer, you can always ask ChatGPT. So like, what is the difference between public and private IP addresses, and give me some examples in each category. So, as it says, they're used to identify devices on the network. Public IP address is a globally unique address, right? It's public, it's out there on the internet. Anyone can type it into their web browser and try to go to it. A private IP address is non-unique. What that means is that because it's tied to a private network, and you, for example, could have your own private home network, and I could have my own private network, we could both have the exact same private IP addresses. And that'll make a bit more sense once I go into the diagram here, but you can see it kind of says at the bottom here that private IP addresses are divided into three ranges. So there's kind of the 10 dot whatever IP address range, and then you got 172s and then the 192s. So, or 192.168 and with all these prefixes and stuff. But the main thing to look at here are these 10 dot X IP addresses, because we'll see that shortly. So kind of looking at our diagram here, this is probably maybe not the it might not be like the most accurate technically in the weeds diagram, but this is kind of how I think of it. And so I'm hoping this will aid you in thinking about it. So you have your computer or your mobile home at home, right? Like when you go to do Hack the Box exercises, you get out your computer, your laptop, whatever it is, you type in your username password on the keyboard, you sign into your computer, and you start interacting with websites. So normally, essentially what's happening there usually, and again, this is just kind of a generic case, your situation might be slightly different, but generally your computer and all your other devices are tied to your own internal private network. So they have an internal private IP address. These are just some example IPs I made up. So assume my computer, for example, that's what this box is. Let me zoom in a bit. Okay, so I have my private network. And if I want to go to a website or talk to the internet, right, or connect to the internet, check my email, go to a website, do something like that, then essentially the way the traffic flows is I start on my private internal network with my private IP addresses. The traffic goes usually through a router. So again, at home, you might have had to turn off and on your router, or you might have had to debug it by like unplugging and plugging in your router again. That's because your traffic needs to go through the router, and then it goes out into the web, and then it fetches your website, your email, whatever you're trying to access, and then the traffic comes back through the router and back into your internal network or private network to your computer. So that's kind of what these arrows are showing, and so you can see basically in terms of the boxes, you have your computer here, and then on your computer, you have your VirtualBox or VMware running, or Chrome running, or Internet Explorer running, Firefox running. You have some applications running on your computer. Your computer itself has a private IP address of, usually it's might be something like 192.168.0.1. Your router then will have a public IP address and a private IP address. So your router will have a private IP address, so you know how to get to it on your private internal network, and then it will have a public IP address so that it can communicate with, I called it the web here, but like the internet and any other public infrastructure. So what we were just talking about is, it said public addresses are unique, right? So we have all these public addresses out here. They're reachable by anyone, they're public, they're out on the internet, and like a famous one, for example, is 8.8.8.8. That's one of Google's. And then you have, just some other random ones I threw in here. Maybe you have a 200.something.something.something, a 199.something.something.something. You've got all these public IP addresses floating out, and they're unique. So for example, this 8.8.8.8 IP address only exists here, like out in the public. There's only one 8.8.8.8 IP address. It's unique. There's only one that exists. Private IP addresses, on the other hand, can be non-unique. So what does that mean? Well, assume this is like my private network. This is my computer, my router, all that stuff. My computer gets this private IP address of 192.168.0.1. It's a private IP address, so it's meant for internal network directing. But you might also have a computer and your own private network, and it's entirely possible that your computer also has the exact same internal IP address of 192.168.0.1, because these IP addresses are only used really for internal network traffic directing. And so it's fine if your computer and my computer have the exact same internal IP address, because essentially the traffic from the web is going to get directed to our individual internal networks, and from there it'll be directed to our computer. So there's no real conflict there, because your computer, if it has the 192.168.0.1 IP address, exists in a completely different private network. And so this ties into the idea of public and private IP addresses. And so you can have public IP addresses, which are a bunch of public assets, and then you can have routers and other kind of network infrastructure with these public IP addresses. And then on the other side of that, you've got these private networks of a bunch of private IP addresses. It's a bunch of computers with these private IP addresses. They can be non-unique in that, like, my computer and your computer could both have the exact same internal private network address, which is fine because they wouldn't exist in the same internal network. So any traffic that gets routed would go to our individual internal networks, and then they would just go to the same internal IP address. Again, I'm not trying to go super in depth into private and public IP addresses. I'm just trying to give a high level overview so we can better understand the concept of the VPN. So taking a step back, let's see. So we did the private IP addresses, and then, okay, so now let's take a look at Hack the Box here. So when you sign into Hack the Box, you'll have a bunch of machines you can choose from. I'm going to do one of the retired ones here. I think you need to be on like one subscription plan higher than the normal one to get access to these retired machines. But the basic concept is the same for all of them, where you'll go to the machine description and then you'll click Spawn Machine. And it will take a few seconds, and then it should give you back an IP address. So just wait for that for a few seconds. But while it's spinning this up, basically what Hack the Box is doing is they're setting up a vulnerable machine in their own private network, right? And we talked about how these private networks have private IP addresses that aren't accessible from the web. If I took this 192.168.0.1 IP address and I just threw it in my web browser, well, I should say if someone else just threw it in their web browser, their computer wouldn't know what to do because their computer can only see the public IP addresses. They can only see this 8.8.8.8. I mean, they could maybe see my public IP address for my router, but they can't see anything behind the router. So if someone else were to put in my private IP address, their browser would just throw an error, or their tool wouldn't work, or they would just basically end in an error state because their computer would not know how to get to my computer. So, because Hack the Box is setting up a vulnerable machine kind of in their own internal network container, let's see if the IP address is there. Yeah. So you can see the IP address we're going to be working with is 10.129.250.120. Notice how this IP address starts with a 10. And we just saw how IP addresses that start with a 10 are private IP addresses. So we can fill out this diagram a bit here. There it goes. Okay, so we now have a vulnerable machine in the Hack the Box private network. Maybe this vulnerable machine has a website on it, some SMB, some other services we're meant to exploit. The machine has an IP address of 10.129.250.120. This is a private IP address. So now we're kind of in a problem, right? We want to test, we want to use our tools and we want to test against this vulnerable machine. But in this diagram, as of now, there's no way for us to reach this vulnerable machine, right? Because if we just put this private IP address in our browser or any of the other tools we use, our computer will not know how to get to this private IP address because it's private. It just doesn't know how to route the traffic there. This is kind of like a closed box, and there's no public IP address for it to get there. So if we can't access this IP address just from the public web, then how are we going to be able to test it and complete the challenge? And that's where the VPN comes in. So let's switch over to my Kali box here. Okay, so this is Kali Linux. I assume you've installed it on VMware VirtualBox. I'm not going to go through how to do that. There's plenty of tutorials how to do that online. But basically, this is where we are, going back to the diagram. So we're kind of in this box here, this VirtualBox VMware. If I type in ifconfig, and that'll give me my network interfaces, and that'll give me my IP addresses. I can see I have a 127.0.0.1 IP address for the loopback, right, which makes sense. 127.0.0.1 always refers to essentially yourself. And then we've got a 192.168.37.143. So that's a private IP address. Okay, so we are in our private network. We're here. We've got our private IP address. We know the IP we want to target, but we don't really have any way of getting there. Because if I try to, for example, nmap, so let's say I nmap the target IP. Let me save it so I don't keep switching back and forth. So if I nmap this private IP address, and I just let that run, we'll see in a second it comes back and says, hey, it seems like the host is down. Why is it saying the host is down? It's because we can't reach that private IP address. Like, the traffic literally cannot reach that IP address, so nmap thinks that the host is down. So it'll give you back that message. So when you're doing Hack the Box exercises or TryHackMe exercises, and you're seeing behavior like this where you know you started the machine, you know it's up, you know you're putting in the right IP address into your tool, and it just keeps saying that the IP address is down, that's probably because you don't have a VPN connection up, so your traffic just literally can't even get to this IP address. So what's the solution? The solution is we're going to use a VPN to basically tunnel into Hack the Box's private network, which will give us a private IP address in their private network, which will then allow us to access the vulnerable machine. So going back to our diagram, basically what we're going to do is we're going to first download a VPN from Hack the Box, which you can do by going to connect to Hack the Box, and then there is a machines here. You choose Open VPN, and then just download VPN. So I will let that download. Okay. That downloads, and then I will go ahead and move that over to my Kali machine, if it will. There it goes. Okay. So switching back to Kali, so we saw how when we tried to nmap this private IP address, we just got, it was down, or in other words, it just, nmap couldn't reach it, so it just reported it as down. Again, the traffic never reached that IP address, so we're not even touching or reaching the IP address at this point in time. But I moved the VPN that I just downloaded into my virtual machine, and if I go to desktop, there it is. Let me go ahead and rename it. Okay, so there it is. So again, remember if I do ifconfig, right now I only have two network interfaces. I have my loopback, and then I have just my private IP address for my private internal network. And I know this is like VMware, and technically this is a NATed network and all that kind of stuff, but for simplicity's sake, we're just going to say this is my internal private network IP. If I take this VPN connection and I run it with sudo open VPN, and I run that, give it the password. Okay, it does a bunch of stuff, and it ends in this state of initialization sequence completed. Okay, if we go back and we see what our IP addresses are now, whoops, ifconfig, we'll see that we have now another network interface, which is TUN0 or tunnel, is how I think of it. And we'll see that the IP address we have on this network interface is a 10.something IP address, which is a private IP address. And because we have this private IP address, and we now essentially have a tunnel into the Hack the Box network, now we can actually reach our target machine. So, scroll up a bit here. If I run that nmap command again, boom, right? Immediately we get a port 80 back. And that's because with this VPN connection, our machine can now reach the Hack the Box network that has their vulnerable machine. And so kind of looking at the diagram again about what exactly happened here. So when we ran sudo open VPN, conceptually we basically, let's see. Yeah, so we ran the VPN connection. Make a different color here. So we ran the VPN connection, and it kind of created a tunnel. Okay. That VPN connection basically created a tunnel. Whoops. Ah, dang it. One sec. There we go. So it created a tunnel to the Hack the Box private network and kind of gave us our own internal IP to work with. And because we are now have a tunnel into the network, and we have a private IP address in the same internal network as the vulnerable Hack the Box machine, we can now talk with the machine directly, right? And then the machine will respond, and it'll just go back. Right, so our VPN connection, once we started it, gave us a tunnel. Essentially, I could do something like this. Gave us a tunnel to get to the Hack the Box private network. And because it gave us that tunnel, it gave us another IP address of 10.10.14.71. right? So it gave us that, and I can put it over here too for, oops. Oh, all right. I'll just leave it over here. Basically, we have this new right. Once we set up that open VPN connection, we have another network interface, which is this private IP address, which is actually the one down here. And because we're basically have a tunnel now into the private internal network, we can now access the vulnerable machine and actually scan it with Nmap and see that port 80 is open. And then port 80 is a website, so we can go to it and then progress with actually testing the box. But the reason I went through this whole step is sometimes your VPN will be a bit like finicky, and maybe you're nmapping the IP address, and for some reason it's showing that no ports are open again. And you're know for sure it's up, you were just testing it, you don't know why this is happening. If you check your VPN connections, sometimes you'll see that it's trying to like reconnect, or if the VPN gets a bit finicky, then essentially this tunnel that we were discussing gets a bit finicky. And so basically by the VPN not being super reliable in certain contextual situations, then your access to the vulnerable machine you're trying to test also becomes unreliable. So that's why if you start a machine and you can't reach it, usually people will tell you to re-download the VPN and run it again, because the idea is that tunnel that allows you to do the testing might just be a bit finicky, or there might be other factors in play that are like closing it or something like that. Or you might have accidentally hit Control C in the background and stopped the connection. And then if you ran Nmap, you'll see it doesn't find anything because there's no more tunnel to the actual internal network to test that box. So this is basically how you test hack the box stuff or TryHackMe. You download their VPN connection, you run the VPN connection, that then gives you a tunnel into whatever internal or private IP space you need. It'll give you an IP address for tunnel, and then once you run this VPN connection, you can then access the internal vulnerable machine, and that will let you do the testing. So that's pretty much it. Hopefully that made sense. There were a couple concepts in here like private IPs, public IPs, private networks, traffic routing, that kind of stuff. I tried to go through pretty quickly. But you can always look into those on your own time, or query ChatGPT, and hopefully that'll help. So with this in mind, I'll just go ahead and start making the rest of the videos testing the individual Hack the Box machines, and assume you're caught up and you have Kali Linux in a VMware or VirtualBox, and that you know how to connect to the machine either in TryHackMe or Hack the Box or whatever you're doing.